a series of McCore conversations where we have been choosing and will continue to choose interesting topics and provide some objective and apolitical, if we can, conversation around some of the hot topics facing Israel and its relationship with North American Jewry and the diaspora. And we will continue to have those conversations, so watch your emails for future announcements. Today, we'd like to address what has become an increasingly hot conversation around the subject of annexation or extending Israeli sovereignty to parts of the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, occupied territory, disputed territory, depending on your political leanings. The terminology, of course, is complicated. And to present a factual and historical view or views on the issue that we're reading about every day now is the CEO, founder and CEO of McCore Educational Journeys. Since you're on this particular call, I suspect that everyone is familiar not only with McCore, but with our lead educator, Ezra, who is in Jerusalem and has much to say about the topic. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ezra. I'll speak about 35 minutes or so. So if you'll all make sure that you're on mute. If you have questions that you'd like to send, you can put them in the chat box to all, or you can send a message privately to me if you'd like, and I'll curate them and bring them to Ezra when he concludes his presentation. Ezra?
Great, thanks a lot, Misha. We'll just get a bit of technical stuff going on here for a moment. Great. So first of all, thank you all for joining. It's kind of odd to be doing this now today, because we should be doing a conversation like this maybe a month ago, 2 months ago. Annexation is supposed to happen, or implementation of Israeli sovereignty is supposed to happen on June 1st. We're not really quite sure what that will be, when that'll be, how that'll be. And what we'd like to try to do tonight is, sorry, it's tonight here, it's afternoon there. What we'd like to try
and
to
I think you meant to say July 1st, and then I'll mute myself.
1st, that's correct. What we'd like to try to do today is put a few things on the table, look at a bit of the background, look at some of the proposals on the table, and look how the Israeli public and maybe the Palestinians a bit also. I have to say at the outset, I feel very uncomfortable speaking for the Palestinians because I am not a Palestinian, but we'll try to share a bit of information on that as well. And really try to put as much as we can on the table in the time that we have allotted. I would like to say at the outset that objectivity is a very difficult thing, because there really is no pure objectivity. Every document, every map, every statement made is not objective, as much as we try or one tries to be objective. It's all connected to a context, and it's all connected to who said, what said, how they wrote it, how they printed it, and the like. So we're going to try and be, or I'm going to try to be, as objective as possible today. I guarantee, I would think probably that there will be things that I say that might rub some people the wrong way in one direction or the other. I really do hope not. And remember that we're talking about a very charged topic. Some of you, I'm sure many of you have been to Israel. Some of you have traveled with me, traveled with McCore or other companies and other people. And there's a lot of information going in all kinds of different directions, and we'll try to give a bit of background. So my technical Zoom abilities sometimes leave much to be desired, but we'll give it a shot. I'm going to share my screen, and just a moment. This is the picture that was on the introduction or on the invitation. If you look at this picture, those of you that read Hebrew, you can see it says Ribonut Yisraelit bebikat HaYarden v'tzfon Yam HaMelech on top. That means Israeli sovereignty in the Jordan Valley and the northern Dead Sea. On the right-hand side are all of the towns, cities, villages, settlements, again, depending on one's definition of this place and space, that will be incorporated into it. On the left-hand side is a map, and that blue area is the Jordan Valley with Jericho, the brown area kind of toward the bottom. I chose this picture because it kind of tells the whole story. This is the Prime Minister who's announcing a plan to implement Israeli sovereignty on the one hand. On the other hand, it's being called annexation. And the Prime Minister has his back to the camera and he's into the map. And the reason I describe it that way is because he prides himself on having a very strong relationship to the land, both physically, figuratively, and ideologically. And so he doesn't care about the camera in this stage, he cares about the map. And we'll get into that a little later. And then we go a bit in another direction. This is a Dry Bones cartoon. Some of you might remember Dry Bones from years ago, Yaakov Kershin, mapping Judea and Samaria, Bibi looking with his telescope, David Friedman, the American ambassador, looking at the map, and Benny Gantz putting his head up from behind a rock. This, Yaakov Kershin is recognized kind of as someone who leans to the right. And the message here is pretty clear. This is kind of the picture that many people are getting. Bibi defined, the American government created the map, and Benny Gantz looked out from the rock as it was happening. This came out during the election campaign. But then there's another cartoon, and here this is a play on a whole bunch of different things, because beyond the whole conversation of annexation or implementing Israeli sovereignty, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, and one of the biggest issues in the past month has been, when are the trains going to start running? And so here you can see Israel Railways is the annexation train. There are two people on the side with their bags deciding, are they going to get on that train or not? And are they going to get on that train or not is a very interesting question, because here, if you go look here, it says mapping Judea and Samaria. That means it's looking at land that belongs to the Jewish people and how do we map it out? Here, it's annexation. This is a train going to annex, and Gantz and Ashkenazi are trying to decide to get on. That's the conversation kind of going on, meaning the Israeli public is interested, much more interested, are the trains going to run, as opposed to, is annexation going to happen? Now, there's no question that as we get closer and closer to July 1st, that's going to shift, but it gives you a sense a bit of some of the things going on here. And now what I'd like to do, I'd like to go to one other, just a moment. I'd like to go to another picture. And the picture I'd like to go to is a picture of, one moment, sorry, I apologize. A map of Judea and Samaria. Now this is a map of Judea and Samaria, and you can see here, it's not Judea and Samaria actually, it's the West Bank. It's got northern West Bank, southern West Bank, and if you look carefully, you'll see the Dead Sea at the bottom. And what was Netanyahu talking about? He was talking about annexation from the top of the Dead Sea up. But then if you look, that top of the Dead Sea up is also Judea and Samaria. And so if you go between these two slides, you can see that there's a very, very significant difference in the conversation between the West Bank and Judea and Samaria. And then we take it one step further and we get to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria with areas A, B, and C. Those are a lot of the terms and a lot of the words that have been thrown around. And I'm sure some of you have heard me say this before, but I'll say it again because it really describes what we're about to dive into. And that is Menachem Begin, when he was elected prime minister in 1977, was insistent on taking every single member of Congress that came to Israel in a helicopter over the entire area of Judea and Samaria to show them how important it was to keep Judea and Samaria. Because after all, if we look at the map, and in a minute we'll pull up a map that's a bit larger, and you can see that just 7 miles from the area that says Qalqilia, you get to the Mediterranean. That's in the northern part of Samaria, or in the northern part of the West Bank. And Nagin wanted to show all these members of Congress how easy it was to crisscross this piece of land, how small it actually was. And the story goes, and it doesn't even matter if it's true, because it really conveys a very strong message. The story goes that when they got in the helicopter, they took off, they flew over Judea and Samaria in Menachem Begin's description. They got off the helicopter, and Begin said to the member of Congress, "So now do you understand why it's so important for us to keep Judea and Samaria?" And the member of Congress, literally without batting an eyelash and not joking at all, said, "Absolutely, but you really have to get out of the West Bank." And if you look at it in those terms, we're throwing semantics and we're throwing words around in all kinds of different ways, because Judea and Samaria is the heartland of the Jewish people. The West Bank is a political term which has become the point of friction, one major point of friction between Israel and Palestinians, Israel and the Arab world. It's a geographic determination that was made after 1949, after the state of Israel was established. And it defines a piece of land that was taken by Israel in war in 1967. Judea and Samaria is exactly that same piece of land, except that didn't start in 1949. That started way back in the days of the Bible. So the conversation isn't between people who say, okay, now we see we're all going to relate to Judea and Samaria. Let's have our conversation about Judea and Samaria. Or people that say, whoops, sorry about that. Or people who say, let's all relate to the West Bank. It's actually some people having a conversation about the West Bank and some people having a conversation of Judea and Samaria. And then there are many more people that are having a conversation of the mishmash between the two, and that's what we're looking at right now. So as a basis, that's where this annexation conversation is starting. And it starts, I have to apologize because my tendency would be to go into much more depth, much more detail, going back to before 1948 and all kinds of things that happened. We're not going to do that. What we're going to do is very, very briefly, in very broad strokes, draw a few lines and then continue and move forward. So what I'd like to do now is just go back and share another screen. Hello again, one moment. And we're back to our train. So we've moved forward and we come to a real question. And that question is the Hebrew word ribonut. You can see a yellow arrow. I'll relate to that in a moment. The Hebrew word ribonut means sovereignty. The state of Israel received sovereignty in 1949, or I would actually say took sovereignty in 1948. When Israel took and declared sovereignty in 1948, they declared sovereignty on a yet to be defined map. A war took place from 1947 actually to May 48, and then 48 through July of 49, at the end of which Israel's borders and boundaries were defined. There was sovereign Israel that didn't have peace with any of its neighbors, had borders that were only truce borders, and there were all the countries around. 1967, Six-Day War, Israel conquered, occupied, liberated, made free, any word you prefer to use, the area that we know as West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Generally speaking, one would say that Israel liberated Judea and Samaria in 1967, and Israel conquered the West Bank in 1967. Those are two acts that represent, or two definitions represent the same thing, but are two very different things. From that moment on, there was a conversation in Israeli society, and that conversation was, what do we do with that territory? And all kinds of ideas and all kinds of things came up. I'll mention a few of the plans that were proposed. I won't go into details. If anybody wants details, you can send it in the chat, or if you prefer, we'll figure it out afterwards. For all those people that are participating, we'll send a number of links giving background to some of these plans and some of these ideas. But basically, the conversation began in 1967. From 1967 to 1973, there was massive euphoria in this country. Israel won. That meant that the country that had really had so many challenges and so much difficulty had in fact been able to establish itself. Nobody was going to beat her. A few settlements were established, and I'm using the word settlement because that's what was used by the people who started the settlements after the Six-Day War. A few settlements were started south of Jerusalem, Gush Etzion, Hebron, but very few others. Then came the 73 war, disaster in 1973. 1974, a group of people get together and they say something is wrong. We are the children of Israel. We are the people who have taken the land of Israel. We have established ourselves sovereignty in the land of Israel. We were given a present 7 years ago, and we did nothing with it. And they established a movement called Gush Emonim, the Block of the Faithful. And their goal was to go into the heartland of the Jewish people. And in that heartland of the Jewish people, the idea was to try and
You're muted, Ezra.
Can you tell me what screen I'm sharing now?
The same one.
The same one, great, thank you. So I didn't make the mistake. So 1974, Gush Emonim begins and settlements are established. And when settlements are established, the attempt is to try and figure out, I'm just going to share another screen now. The attempt is to try and figure out how do you then move forward, but not move forward with the continuity of what the state was. How do you move the state forward in another direction? And that direction is to bring the Messiah. You want to move forward and take the land of the Jewish people, which is the heartland of the Jewish people. And in so doing, you want to say the Messiah is actually going to come. And the Messiah is going to come. Sorry, I'm having a bit of technical difficulty here. One moment. The Messiah is going to come when whoopsie, just a moment. The Messiah is going to come when Israel doesn't only build up on the coastal plain that you can see on this map, but Israel builds up Samaria, you can see it here on top, and Judea. Because that's where the Bible was, that's where the stories took place, that's really the heartland of the Jewish people. And so from 1974 through 1977, there are all kinds of attempts to settle that area. The government isn't too keen on it, it's a labor government, but settlements are established, communities are established. From 1977, Menachem Begin comes in, then many more settlements are established, and somebody's got their mic on. And over a course of time, and if you were to look at a chart, the truth of the matter is that there's a constant steady building of Jews who are moving into the area known as the West Bank or Judean Samaria, to the point where by the year 2020, where we are today, there are 450 or so thousand Jews living in the area known as Judean Samaria or West Bank. At the same time, there are other forces going on in Israeli society that are saying, we cannot keep that territory, because by keeping that territory, one, we'll never make peace with the Arabs. Two, we'll have a demographic issue whereby the residents of that area, if they become Israeli citizens, will change the demographic balance. Or if they don't become Israeli citizens, we'll turn Israel into a non-democratic state. That's the conversation that's been going on. I've left out all kinds of details, but that brings us to the point where we are today. And that point where we are today is that a plan has been put forward to say, we're now going to take the territory that was in question and we're going to make it Israeli. Now, there were all kinds of plans over the past 25 years. Up until 1993, there were all kinds of ideas that came up, including in 1967, which was the Elon plan. It was a kind of a grandiose plan to return almost half of the territory to Jordan, keep the Jordan Valley and a few other parts for Israel. There were all kinds of renditions of that plan. Nothing evolved of it. There was the Oslo Accords that were established in 1993. There was the Geneva Accords, the Geneva Plan, right? There was the Olmert Plan. There was the Beilan-Abu Mazen Plan. These are all plans that were trying to figure out a way to get to figuring out how to cut up the territory so that there would be some Israeli, some Palestinian. Questions of, will there be a Palestinian state or not? Questions of, how do you define how much territory is given and how much isn't? Until this moment, all of those conversations, at least over the past 15 years, have dealt with two numbers, 78 and 22. Why 78 and 22? Because what you're looking at now is 100% of the map of the land of Israel. That's all 100%. If you take off Gaza and the West Bank, or Gaza and Judea and Samaria, the state of Israel is left with 78%. That means that there are 22% left. There is 22% left. In all the negotiations that took place since the Oslo Accords, an understanding was reached that whatever would happen, Israel would get 78%, the Palestinians would get 22%. In those conversations, in those negotiations, settlements were related to. And why were they related to? Because there would be something called land swaps. Land swaps, land that theoretically is under Palestinian control should move to Israeli control, and land that's under Israeli control should move to Palestinian control. The plan that we're discussing now, the Trump plan, which has been the instigator for wanting to bring annexation now or Israeli sovereignty now, also uses the concept of land swaps, but it doesn't use the numbers of 78 and 22. And here, this is the Trump plan of the century. The Trump plan of the century, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see two maps. I'm sure many of you have seen those maps. These two maps represent the two maps of the Trump plan, one which shows the Israeli presence and one which shows the Palestinian presence. It's exactly the same map, but the one on the right shows what will be under Palestinian control. The one on the left shows what will be under Israeli control and what will be the status and situation of all of the settlements that will be embedded inside Palestinian territory. In addition to that, it also shows sites of land swaps. And so if you look at the map, you can see that in the middle, there is what's known as West Bank, Judea, Samaria. Then you move over to the left and you can see the Gaza Strip. And then you go down and you see two more spaces. Those are spaces that will be given to the Palestinians on the Egyptian border, connected to Gaza by a road and connected to the main center of the West Bank by a road as well. That was the conceptual vision. And then if you look on the right-hand side of your map, of your screen, you can see what the map actually looks like. This is a map that was produced by the Washington Institute. I'll send the link with all the other documents. But what you can see here is the purple is the land that Israel will annex. The yellow is Palestinian territories or Palestinian localities. The red line is the seam zone barrier, or otherwise known as the barrier. This is what was put on the table. The big question is, what will Prime Minister Netanyahu try to implement on the 1st of July that fits in to this map? Will it just be the Jordan Valley, which is the purple strip on the left-hand map? Will it be the Jordan Valley and settlement blocks? What are the settlement blocks? The settlement blocks, the best way to understand and see the settlement blocks, the best way to see, to understand what the settlement blocks are, is if you look at the area of Jerusalem, and the West Bank kind of looks like a kidney, or it looks like a backwards 3. And if you look at the heart of that backwards 3, that's Jerusalem. And some of you might be able to see my mouse. It's pointing at Jerusalem right here. It's pointing at Jerusalem right here. 2 of the main settlement blocks that are under discussion are Gush Etzion down here. Misha, if you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see the mouse moving. Can you all see the mouse? Yes, you can, great. And this is the Gush Etzion settlement block. This is the Ma'ale Adumim settlement block. And this is the Ariel settlement block. So what's on the table now? What's on the table is the entire Jordan Valley, the Ma'ale Adumim settlement block, the Gush Etzion settlement block, the Ariel settlement block, and all of the settlements in this area. That means all of the purple. Because one of the possibilities is that, and I'm using now language used by the Prime Minister, is that when when the implementation of sovereignty takes place, the implementation of sovereignty will take place in the Jordan Valley and in all of the Jewish settlements. That goes back to the Oslo Accords, if you recall. The Oslo Accords talked about Area A, B, and C. Area A is total Palestinian control, Area B is partial Palestinian control, and Area C is pretty much everything else, but specifically, all of the settlements are in Area C. Those different options are what are on the table now. And just to give you a bit more of a sense of what it is, what you're looking at here is one possibility. The possibility you're looking at is annexation of everything within the barrier. That means that if you look at this map that shows the West Bank, the barrier goes from the middle of the Dead Sea into Jerusalem around what you know as Latrun up to the top. Everything within the barrier means basically the settlement blocks plus a few other things that are just on the edge of the barrier, but none of the settlements in the heartland of Judea and Samaria. Annexation of Gush Etzion. Jerusalem is right here. Gush Etzion is here. One of the possibilities is to annex Gush Etzion, not with a road that comes down from Jerusalem, but into Israel proper, right here. All of these possibilities are there. And what it leads to is a situation where the Israeli public sees these maps, sees these lines, and has absolutely no idea what's going to happen. The public discussion is taking place between a number of different groups in Israeli civic and public society. And the people in that discussion, interestingly enough, are divided on all kinds of different lines. So there are those people that are 100% behind the plan for annexation. They are generally people who are from the more pragmatic side of the settlement movement, people who are part of the Likud party and believe in, one, the political importance of connection to the land of Israel, the importance of growing the size of the land of Israel step by step and not going for broke, and people who are using a total security standpoint to say that the more land Israel is able to control, the better that is. That's one group of people. Another group of people that is vehemently opposed to it is the hardcore of the settlement movement. The hardcore of the settlement movement was in Washington when the plan was announced. They met with a prime minister after the plan was announced. There were all kinds of rumblings. They came out with a statement and they said, we support the plan. Why? Because it will provide for sovereignty over more territory in the land of Israel. About 2 weeks ago, that same group of people came out extremely strongly against it. And what you're looking at are two screenshots from a video clip from Yisrael Gantz, who is the mayor of the Benjamin Regional Council. That's the mid-northern West Bank, southern Samaria, who put together a clip. It's called in Hebrew, it's not called Plan of the Century, it's called Tochnit HaMe'ah, the Plan of 100. And the idea here was that 100% is good. So he used that all the time, and he kept on saying in this clip, 100 is bad, 100 is bad. And these are two clips, and what do they show? That the Trump plan mentions a Palestinian state 159 times, and it mentions Israeli sovereignty 7 times. What's the message? The message is that the Trump plan doesn't really care so much about sovereignty. The Trump plan cares about a Palestinian state. So people come to him and say, wait a second, you were in Washington. They said, no, when we were in Washington, we saw the plan, but we were led to believe something else. That's one. Then you come to another personality. Some of you might recognize the face of the person sitting in the middle. His name is Oded Ravivi. He's the mayor of Efrat. He's sitting here this afternoon in, I believe it's Kikar Rabin Square, with Lucy Arish, not by coincidence, interviewing Nitzan Horowitz. Now, if you, those of you that might be familiar with Oded Ravivi, he is also a mayor from a West Bank community, a Judean Samaria community. He's actually the spokesman of the Judean Samaria Council to the foreign press. The Judean Samaria Council have come out totally against the annexation. Their spokesman has come out totally in favor of the annexation. Few reasons. One, he's a member of the Likud party. He's not a member of any of the political parties further to the right of Likud, number one. Number two, he's a very pragmatic Likud politician. And so he's sitting there with Lucy Arish, who is a Palestinian Israeli newscaster on an online channel called the Democracy Channel, interviewing the head of Meretz, who's talking about why annexation is horrible. Oded Ravivi is answering him why annexation is good. Nitzan Horowitz says back to him, but all your people are against it. And he says, yes, but they're not really understanding how good it will be for the Jewish people. So that's another group of people represented here by Oded Ravivi. We move on. Who are coming out vehemently opposed to the annexation, and they're not calling it the implementation of sovereignty. Obviously, Nitzan Horowitz, people on Israel's hard left, although many of us, all of us know really, that Israel's left has really shrunk drastically. And so it's the left that is coming out very much against it. And it's the center and center left that are totally confused. Because if you remember that cartoon from the very beginning that shows Gantz standing there, hiding his head behind the rock. On the one hand, the center voted for Gantz, for Kachol Lavan. Kachol Lavan split. Gantz went with Bibi. Part of the government agreement, the coalition agreement, was that Gantz's people could vote their own conscience, but there would be a referendum or there would be a government decision on implementing sovereignty. And so what you have then is quite a big fight on the right. You have confusion in the center. You have pushback on the left. And you have a government who hasn't yet told us really what will be, but it's pretty clear that what I described are going to be some of the main directions. One last point before we open it up to questions. This picture that I had up before says Ribonut, sovereignty. It's interesting that sovereignty has been discussed in Israel since 1967, but it's been on the back burner. Most Israelis didn't really engage with it. And when anybody brought it up, it was pushed aside because the intention was the final status of Judea and Samaria has to be as part of an agreement. Annexing of Jerusalem right after 67 was one thing. Extending Israeli law to the Golan Heights, basically annexing it in the early 1980s, was in that same category. But the West Bank / Judean Samaria, because it affects the demography of the state of Israel, because it affects the democratic nature and Jewish nature of the state of Israel, it has to be part of a much larger conversation. And then if you look at the arrow on this picture, it points to the year 2013. This was the first journal of a journal called Ribonut Sovereignty. And the headline is, Minister Uri Ariel says, he's not using sovereignty here, right? He's using the word lisapech, which means, I'll mark it right there with my mouse. Lisapech means to annex without any concern for the demographic disaster. Hashed is really like the democratic ghost, the demographic ghost. Uri Ariel, a leader of one of the more right-wing parties in the Israeli Knesset, said, we need to annex, we don't have to worry, everything will be fine. That was 2013. This journal was not very accepted. 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, more and more and more conversations about what will happen. And so the question is why? There's been so many conversations in the cybersphere about all of this. I'm not going to go into it, but I will say the following. One, I actually wrote it down because I wanted to be clear on it. But here it is. One, I described why not, right? Demography, democratic nature of the state. The Arab countries all around are furious. The Palestinian society is furious. The fear of what will happen if this takes place, no one really knows. Jordan has threatened. Abu Dhabi has threatened. All of these countries that Israel has actually warmed up relations with, I'm not talking about Jordan for the moment, but the countries in the Gulf are saying that if this continues and if this happens, that will stop. Jordan has been saying that the peace treaty, which was already on tenterhooks, is now in grave danger. And Netanyahu is saying that we understand the danger, we can live through it. In fact, the head of the Mossad went to meet, rumor has it, with a king today, and with a secret message from Netanyahu. The Palestinian street potentially might blow up. Khalil Shkaki, who's a very, very highly respected Palestinian academic, described the situation last week as a situation where the leadership wants the street to come out. The street doesn't want to come out. In the Palestinian street, the two-state solution has kind of become passé. Now they're moving toward a one-state solution. The Palestinian Authority is very eager for the people to come out, and they're not coming out because of all the distrust there is. So that's what's going on partially in Palestinian society. Those that want to be cynical, and there are many who want to be cynical, and some say that they're not being cynical, they're just being realistic, say that this conversation is here because of Netanyahu's trials. All of these things are out there. They're all part of the public dialogue, trying to figure out where do priorities lie, what decisions will be made, where will lines be drawn, who's going to make those decisions, what's going to happen in the Knesset. Will this conversation lead to more elections, the fourth election round in a 1.5 or 2 year period? No one really knows. It's pretty clear. 2 days ago, Benny Gantz said that if the Palestinians can't make a decision, then we have to move forward. And the irony of all this is that for Israel's center, annexing the Jordan Valley has always been out there. Derech HaShlishit, a party in the 20 years ago, their platform was to annex the Jordan Valley. And so we're here in a situation where this is hitting us very, very quickly. Everybody is talking about it in the realm of those people who talk about it and give ideas. The people on the street, not really. And we'll see what happens on July 1st. I'm sure I left out a lot, and I want to leave room for questions. I hope you were all able to follow in one way or another, and we can go to questions.
Thanks, Ezra. We do have a couple questions, but before I read the 2 questions that are on the board, in your view, would this move advance the conversation toward a 2-state solution? Is that even a realistic view, or does it move? Is it creeping annexation of the entire West Bank toward a 1-state solution? And if so, what does this say about the Israeli view about Palestinian citizenship or non-citizenship? and the A word, apartheid, that has been tossed around in the center-left circles here, and I'm sure in Israel as well.
I referred to that when I talked about the Jewish and democratic nature, and I'm glad you brought that up. First of all, the term two-state solution is not really a term used here in Israel. The term that's used is Palestinian state. You know, people talk about two states, but there is a state here. So it's the Palestinian state, that's number one. Number two, the Intifada, those of you that follow Yossi Klein Halevi, he actually says it very clearly and very straightforwardly. The Intifada wore down a lot of people and set aside the conversation about Israelis and Palestinians. And people disconnected. And as people disconnected, the conversation about a two-state solution kind of moved to a back burner. On the one hand, on the other hand, many people still do want that type of solution. The question is that something that vast majority of people in Israel want? I think the voting results that happened in the last elections pretty much show that it's really not at the top priority of Israelis to have a two-state solution. What does that mean? That means that people do want a solution. Most people, many people don't believe that at this point a two-state solution is possible. The level of distrust is astronomical. Then you go to the Trump plan. And in the Trump plan, there's the conversation of a two-state solution. When it was brought out, the argument was, well, you know, this is going to take a 4-year process and we're not really sure. And the argument is that Palestinians won't take it anyway, so what's the problem? Most Israelis are not fully engaged in that conversation yet. They were during the Oslo process. They feigned out during the second Intifada. Could this bring about another conversation on a two-state solution? Many people are saying that if the annexation takes place in the entirety that Netanyahu talked about in the first map that I showed with the Jordan Valley and Israeli settlements, they say that is an end to the two-state solution. If you think back to Camp David of 1978, when autonomy was raised, and when autonomy was raised, there was also talk against a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. That was set aside rather quickly. We're in the stage now where the Palestinians have a certain level of autonomy. The balance between the Israeli military and the Palestinian military, the Palestinian society, is such that we all know that Israel is, on the one hand, in control of the overall area, but the Palestinians, for those of you that have been into Ramallah and to Bethlehem, know, have built up quite a very strong infrastructure. The security cooperation between Palestinians and Israelis was, until 2 weeks ago, very, very, very strong. It was the main backbone of the relationship. That was disconnected 2 weeks ago, and even after it was disconnected, the Palestinian security services, working together with Israeli security services, worked to solve issues that arose on the ground. So even though it was officially cut off, there are very strong roots in that. So going back to your question about the two-state solution, I don't think at this point that it's going to bring it closer. I don't know that it's pushing it much further off, won't bring it closer. The other question that you raised about the Jewish and democratic nature of Israel and an apartheid state. I have to say that I'm one who always said that apartheid isn't the word to use when discussing Israel and when discussing the West Bank of Judea and Samaria. When the Prime Minister made a statement about 2 weeks ago saying that any annexation plans or any implementation of sovereignty in these areas would not entail citizenship or residency for the Palestinians or for the Arabs living there, that set off, for me, some very, very red lights, because the state of Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, and the second part of that state is sovereign, and people living on that sovereign territory do not have citizenship or do not have the rights of citizenship. That no longer is a state that can call itself democratic to the nth degree. There are all kinds of reasons people will give on the flip side to say that it's a security risk and we can't give citizenship to those people who might in fact be a fifth column. There's an argument for the Bedouins in the Judean desert that they never really had citizenship of any country They were always nomadic, so there's no need to give them citizenship. These are all things that have been brought up in conversation. It's a major, major question. It's a major, major issue. And hopefully we'll get to a stage where we don't have to discuss the situation of what happens if.
Do you want to just read the questions that are on the chat screen and take them? Starting with Keith Kravitsky's question.
I'm looking. If you wouldn't mind reading it, because
What about, well, Keith asks about the various plans that you showed on the maps and what that does in terms of what are the general ratios of the populations of those areas. In other words, if Israel was to extend Israeli law, sovereignty, and annex those areas, does that include a lot of Palestinians?
right. So there's a very interesting number here, and that interesting number is 109,000. There are, if the full annexation takes place, there will be 109,000 Palestinians under Israeli control, and there will be 109,000 Israelis who are on the other side of the security fence, interestingly enough. So if you say that there are 450 or so settlers or people living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, of those 450,000, 109 would be in places that would be problematic for them. That 450 doesn't take into account the 200,000 people living in neighborhoods in East Jerusalem.
So thank you. A second question has to do with the de facto Israeli Sunni Arab alliance vis-a-vis Iran, and with all of the objections that are coming very vehemently from the Arab world, what does this these new developments potentially do to that alliance?
So yeah, the alliance is really quite interesting, because what's happened over the past 5 or 6 years is that secret relationships that really began around the Oslo Accords have become very, very public, to the point where the synagogue in Dubai, I believe it is, now has public signs outside that a distant relative of the king in Saudi Arabia came to visit in Israel, is a friend of Yair Netanyahu on Facebook. Yair Netanyahu is known very, very clearly as a extremely vocal person on Twitter and Facebook. Almost every tweet that Yair Netanyahu puts out is retweeted by this relative of the king in Saudi Arabia. Netanyahu has taken amazing pride in that evolving relationship. The question is, what will happen? Netanyahu believes that they will ride the wave, and in riding the wave, by the end, the relationship will become stronger. Interestingly enough, vis-a-vis Iran, Uzi Arad was just interviewed last week. Uzi Arad was a very senior official in the Mossad in the early 90s, was Netanyahu's, in his first round as prime minister, was one of his senior aides, chairman of the National Security Agency, come out recently very vehemently against Prime Minister Netanyahu. Uzi Arad said that the Iran deal that now has ended, in fact, creates a situation where any control that there might have been is totally gone, which means that as far as Israel is concerned, and as far as the Sunni nations are concerned, the Sunni nations are now even more afraid of Iran, which means that if Iran is higher up on the list, then Iran will go with Israel again. The Sunni nations will go with Israel against Iran, as opposed to the Sunni nations going against Israel vis-a-vis the annexation. I don't know vocally, but quietly.
Another question has to do with the quiet voice of the Israeli left. Where is it, and what alternative plans have people surfaced, and have they been? Is there any alternative plan coming from the left? And And since we know that Abu Mazen won't live forever, who's in line and what prospects are there to eventually break through the sense that the Palestinians have veto power over anything that Israel puts on the table?
So as far as the Israeli left, you saw in the recent elections what happened with the Israeli left with Meretz, with the Labor Party. Some people are saying that we can't really judge and gauge based on the 3 elections because it was the epitome of a colossal balagan. By the time it got to the 3rd elections, nobody knew who was connected to what and where and who, and people jumped between parties in every possible direction. Having said all of that, it's pretty clear that the Israeli left, and I have to be honest, I really don't like using that word. Left and right are kind of economic terms, and here it doesn't cut on economic lines. You can call it doves and hawks, you can call it all kinds of other things. The Israeli left has imploded. Everyone recognizes it. I want to focus on that. The Zionist left has imploded, not necessarily the left. And that's the saddest part. There are people who will say that they are, will call themselves left-wing, but would have difficulty calling themselves Zionists. So the real question is, where is the Zionist left? Not really the Israeli left. And the Zionist left, meaning people who believe in Jewish peoplehood, people who believe in Jewish nationalism, as a good word, not as a bad word. And I know one has to be very careful today in how one uses all of these words. People who believe in the right of the Jewish people to define themselves as a people and as a nation, on the one hand, but who also have a responsibility when they have power. And that's the core that needs to build itself up. And at the moment, it's having great difficulty. And with a great difficulty that it's having, what's known as the Israeli right, which is also cut up in all kinds of different ways. If you just look at the map on the Israeli right, there's Likud. Within the Likud, you have 3 or 4 different camps that can cover quite a spectrum. You have the national religious parties, Beit Yehudi, that also has 2 or 3 other parties that are infighting. Somebody went from the religious home party to the Likud to become a minister. All kinds of things going on. The definition of right and left in Israel is kind of in a blender at the moment. And a blender can do one of 2 things. It can either put pieces together and come out with something new, or it can destroy everything. I don't think it'll destroy everything. I think it'll take time, but there are redefinitions going on now. Listen to any radio talk show in Israel today, you hear people talking about it all the time. The left knows that it is in abysmal shape, and that's the situation.
What happens on the other side with Mahmoud Abbas and his and successors?
So Mahmoud Abbas, I'm sure some of you have been to Rawabi, and I'm quoting this here because he said it in public, so I think I can say it in public. Bashar al-Masri, who is the developer in Rawabi, was asked by a group I was there with once about Mahmoud Abbas. It was at a time when he wasn't happy with the Palestinian leadership. It all depends, obviously, on what's going on. All he said was, do you know any other leader in the world who's about 86 years old? That was the one sentence. So
But just to return, we were going to do that. We were going to do that.
Somebody's
and you guys thought that was a good idea.
Here, 1 minute. So it's in crisis. Again, according to Khalil Shkaki, it's not really clear who there is. There are people who would like power, but there is a lot of distrust between the street and the Palestinian leadership. The irony of all that is that the people involved in NGOs in Palestinian society are doing amazing things. There are extremely able people involved in developing all kinds of things in Palestinian society. And if 20 years ago and 15 years ago, those people were very much connected to Israeli society, today they are very much removed from Israeli society. And one major thrust in Israeli society, in Palestinian society, especially led by the Palestinian Authority, but kind of they are being led by the people, is anti-normalization. The idea that you don't engage with Israel, especially with the annexation plan or the sovereignty plan. You don't engage with Israel. It's inappropriate to engage with Israel. on business matters, on academic matters. It's a wall being built. And so you have these very, very able Palestinian leaders. Some of you who might have met them, people who really know their stuff, people who really are very committed to the Palestinian cause and to the causes they work for. They have total distrust in the Palestinian leadership. They have total disdain for the Israeli leadership. They have some relationships with their counterparts in Israeli civil society, but those two are pulling apart to a certain degree. I maintain contacts with some Palestinians. I spoke to someone from Ramallah yesterday. I spoke to someone from East Jerusalem today. Even somebody from East Jerusalem liked this on Facebook. And so there is conversation, but the relationship is not good at the moment. And as far as who's going to take over after Abbas, no one really knows.
We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here, Ezra. The question that's being asked is, what are the real forces that are going to ultimately push this move toward a decision? So what's going to happen? And can people outside of Israel have any influence to put their finger on the scales? And I think, and an ancillary part of that question is, does Netanyahu and his people care about what American and world Jews think about this move, or does he have his back to the camera?
So what's going to define what goes on? First of all, I'm just lowly Ezra Korman. I don't know, but I'll give you what I think. One, there are a number of different things going on that are pressing on the government or on Netanyahu, whoever's making these decisions. One is what's happening in the outer rim around Israel, meaning the city-states going around to Iran. Two, what's happening in the inner circle, which is what's happening in Palestinian society. Three, and this is just who Netanyahu is, where is Netanyahu in how he sees himself vis-a-vis his base, and in how he is able to see a few steps down the road. I don't want to be cynical and say this is all a ploy by him to maneuver the court, to maneuver his base. He really comes from a very, very strongly ideological background, and he sincerely believes in what he's doing. He also is, by all recognition, one of the most able, conniving, we'll put another word in the opposite direction, blessed politicians there is in the world. And so it's a whole big mishmash of all those things. Interestingly enough, Netanyahu has always been very, very careful not to, as an example, not to apply land troops to any military action. Very, very careful. He's done it, but rarely. He talks big and then focuses in because he recognizes what's going on around him. And so in that context, the question is, in this case, will he recognize what people perceive to be going on around him and pull in? Or will he say with his advisors, what people are saying is going on around you is irrelevant? There's another element here too, and that is the elections in the United States. I commiserate with you. What we read here in the Israeli press about what's going on in the United States is horrific. That's all I can say, and I hope sometimes they're exaggerating. But with that, we all know there's an election in November. And we all know that Biden is rising in the polls and Trump is sliding in the polls. I don't know if sliding is the right word. That's also being taken into account. The bottom line is that if my guess is that if push comes to shove, and he's convinced that this action will lead Israel into a devastating, bloody, violent confrontation, then he'll take a step back. But the other question,
Okay.
we can go on a bit if anybody, we said an hour and you can, thank you very much. For those people that need to leave, we'll be sending out this recording Our recording will be on our website, and we'll send out links to a number of sources and resources that might be helpful to you, just to try and deepen this as well. We can take one or two further questions if you'd like.
Well, going beyond the American Jewish community and perhaps the assumption that, after some kerfuffle, the American Jewish community will fall in line and continue to support Israel no matter what. But the international implications, the United Nations, European Union, all these other countries that are being very vocal about this. What's Netanyahu's reaction to that? What's the government's reaction to that?
You need a bit of historical context to look at this, and then a bit of world updates. As far as historical context, if you remember, from 1967 through the 90s, Israel did, and the world condemned, and the world moved forward. The annexation of Jerusalem, various activities that took place in between certain settlements, the annexation of the Golan Heights, the famous statement of David Ben-Gurion in the 1950s, Shmum. That's, we're strong enough, we can do it. We have chutzpah, we'll move forward and do it. To my mind, the world has changed a bit, and the support for Israel from the sources that used to support Israel is not there. And so the reaction is going to be a much sharper and harsher reaction, and more difficult and more challenging. The attitude, if the clip that I showed of the mayor of the Binyamin Regional Council, in that clip, he basically says, like, we can do it. It doesn't matter. We basically have God on our side. Nobody is going to stop us. The non-messianic version of that is, we can do it. We're strong. We have the chutzpah. We have the right. They'll get over it. That's pretty much the attitude. There are certain buttons that those countries can push, which will stop it. One of those buttons is the court in The Hague, in The Hague. When Khan al-Ahmar, some of you might be familiar with it, the Bedouin encampment in the Judean desert, when Khan al-Ahmar was going to be removed, and it came very, very close, the reason in the end it didn't happen was because of the International Court in The Hague. And it threatened that Israeli leaders, Israeli generals, officers, anybody that had anything to do with serving in the West Bank by their definition, would be liable to arrest and prosecution. Specifically, the decision not to take it down came after a meeting between Angela Merkel, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, in which they also discussed another issue, which was the submarine deal between Israel and Germany. That one I know because I spoke to someone that was in the room about it. So there's so many different levels about what is going on. I only know a few.
How does the coronavirus affect the potential for extending Israeli sovereignty into the territories?
You're really talking to the wrong person, because when you say, how does the coronavirus affect, we're doing Zoom calls. That's what the coronavirus affects. Like, there's so many question marks. One of the big complaints.
Well, isn't there, there's been a lot of cooperation, right, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority on containing the virus, and with all the breakdown in communication, security, and health. What does this have an impact on the timeline?
Right. So the answer is yes. Look, here in Israel, we were like way out there and things were great, and now we're skyrocketing again. So that's yesterday there were over 500 cases that were identified. So it's not really clear what's going to happen here in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority. It does affect it. It will affect it. Part of how it's affecting it is because the astronomical cost that will be involved in extending sovereignty. And there's one thing I neglected to mention, which is one of the reasons why many people are pushing for it, is because it will change the status of Israelis who live in settlements or in communities in Judea and Samaria, or settlements in the West Bank. At this point, everything over the Green Line is under the administration of the military administration, the civil authority. That means that an Israeli living in Gush Etzion, for instance, the person responsible for him is the government of Israel, but under the government of Israel is the general in charge of the West Bank through the civil authority. So every government ministry in the Israeli government has a parallel in the civil authority, an officer of the rank of major. So there is the Ministry of Finance. There's the person from the army responsible for finance in Judea and Samaria. If there is the Ministry of Law, it's the same thing. And so what this would get rid of a massive layer of bureaucracy that exists today between people who live in settlements and the Israeli general bureaucracy. That's something which will also cost a lot of money. The military effort to then recreate the boundaries and borders will cost a lot of money. With the massive economic downslide that Israel is going through now because of the coronavirus, that will. And then on a practical level, engaging with Palestinians has been very, very challenging over the past. I'm just talking about workers coming in. Palestinian workers were not allowed to come in for about 3.5 weeks, literally not allowed out of the West Bank and not allowed into Israel. There's talk that as of Sunday that will be reinstituted. So it's throwing a lot of question marks into the conversation.
Is there any closing words before we thank everyone and sign off?
I'd just like to say that, first of all, thank you all for participating and listening. I hope it gave you a little bit of what this picture is about. Having said all of that, life is going on here very normally in the context of Corona, right? What's affecting life here is not annexation or sovereignty. What's affecting life here is Corona. So I went to a wedding 3 days ago. Very strange going to a wedding with 250 people because that's the limit. And, we stood in the back, we had our masks on. People in the 20-so age range just like threw off their masks, went dancing in the middle. And that was, we all laughed. That was a wedding. Streets are full in Israel. Things are going on in Israel. People are talking about the annexation. People are talking about sovereignty, but on a very, very low burner. And so with all of that, the country, believe it or not, is still thriving in a very, very difficult way, a very challenging way. And this, fortunately or unfortunately, is not at the top of the priority list. I will say, I try to be as objective as possible. I have to say that the act of extending sovereignty over land and not giving citizenship to people who live in that land, I believe, and I don't usually share my opinions, but on this is it's a yehareg uval ya'avor kind of thing. I believe that it is a colossal error for the Zionist endeavor. And I really hope that that won't happen. I'm not saying annexation or not annexation, whatever happens, happens, but there is an obligation to give citizenship to the people living on land that is under your control. And so let's hope that that actually happens if the annexation does happen.
Ezra, thank you so much for being so candid and telling the truth, your truth from Jerusalem. And thanks everyone who joined the call today. If you have any ideas as to people or topics that you'd like the Makor conversations, since we expect to be in this situation for a long time, and if you have any ideas for us, you can send them to me, misha@makorjourneys.com, or to Ezra at ezra@igt.co.il. Thanks so much, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye, everybody.